Sorry for the technical problems. Now I'd like to start the panel session 2.1 of the third Global Climate and SDGs Synergy Conferences. The title of this session is Overcoming Barriers, Financing, Technology, and Innovation. My name is Yasuo Takahashi, Executive Director of the IGES, and it is my great honor and pleasure to moderate this important session. First of all, I would like to sincerely welcome all the distinguished speakers from all over the world attending physically or virtually. Actually, I have Mr. Takao Aiba on the panelist, one of the panelists here at UNU in Tokyo. All the other speakers will join remotely. I am also pleased to welcome Ms. Yurika Morii, Japan Youth Platform for Sustainability, on this podium to make comments from the perspective of youth at the end of this session. I also like to welcome all the participants joining this session here in Tokyo or virtually from the various parts of the world. Thank you so much for joining us today. This session will focus on the important means of implementation for advancing climate and SDGs synergies in action, including access to and use of public and private finance, technological innovation, as well as capacity development at local and national levels. As many participants in this conference have already pointed out, we still have a big gap to attain the goals of SDGs and Paris Agreement, and we definitely need to accelerate our efforts. And it is clear that finance, technology, and innovation will be the critical factors. I very much look forward to having active and innovative discussions today to give us some hints for our future efforts to further enhance the synergies between climate policies and SDGs toward the attainment of our ambitious goals. Before starting the session, I would like to explain how to address the question from the floor. We welcome the questions from the audience, so please use the Q&A box for your questions to speakers. I also like speakers to kindly write answers to the questions as much as possible during the session, because we have no time to have a Q&A session in this panel discussion. So now I would like to welcome our first speaker, Mr. Vekachalam Ambumose, Director of Research, Strategy and Innovation Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia or area, for making a keynote statement. In his speech, he will respond to the three questions as follows. How can we leverage further engagement of private sectors? How can we overcome the digital divide in less and least developed countries? And what is the role of regional international cooperation in achieving the synergies? So, Mr. Ambumose, the floor is yours.
That exist among these SDGs, particularly the SDGs and the SDG 13, the climate change, to reshape these 2030 pathways. If we fail to do so, we will be failing in delivering this 2030 agenda. And the third message, that is there is a complex interlinked barriers exist. These barriers are in the policy domain, or the institutional domain, or the market domains. So we need a kind of a new governance framework that include taking advantage of this digital technologies that provide. So the digital technologies can alleviate some of these complex challenges. So if you look into these SDGs, again, as mentioned by Taka-san, and here we need a nexus approach. And this nexus approach of technology and the finance and the innovation. Innovation is the basic. By continuing the business as usual, we cannot attain this target, 2030 targets. So we need a innovation that is supported by the finance, innovative financing mechanisms. But it has to come from this private sector. And if you look into this SDG business, and where this new business are focusing on which SDGs, and we did a survey for the and the ASEAN and East Asia, about 16 economies in the region, and we found that is the where these SDG businesses are focusing on. That comes from the provision of the clean water and sanitation. Second is the affordable or clean energy. And third one is the industry and innovation infrastructure. And fourth one is the sustainable cities and communities. The fourth one is the climate change. So here, if you look into this, how this governance structure of this private investments is happening, here we find a very unique characteristics in this region. And this priority SDGs with a large difference between the rating of millennials and the non-millennials. Here, the hope is, that is most of this young generation who owns these companies, and then new ideas of innovation and entrepreneurship is coming from these millennials. These young people are looking forward to invest. They wanted to find a better place to live. And if you combine together and also analyzing these early adopters of the SDG goals, we found there are 4 characteristics. One is the organizational size is important. Second is this reporting of the sustainability is important, and the corporate governance attributes. And this all will lead into maximizing the profit while minimizing these environmental impacts. But if you look into the 2030, and we need a completely additional spending that is required. And these are the 2 countries in this region, Indonesia, the largest in the Southeast Asia, and the Vietnam. And here, for example, in the education, health, and the road sector that is related to the SDGs, we need about more than 6% of the GDP in the next 8 years. And Vietnam, it is around 7% of the GDP is needed to meet these SDG goals and the climate targets. But so far, what is planned is these investments will be coming from the private sector, public sector, which is a wrong conceptualization. And these gaps, that is what is needed in these countries, and individual countries are in billions. And if you
Mr. Ambumozi, the slide is not moving. It's okay. It's still the first page.
Oh, sorry. And I'm really moving it. And
could you please select the right slides for your presentation?
Sorry, and actually from my computer, actually I could able to see, and the slides are moving. Can I start it again?
Sorry. So please continue your presentation.
Okay, and then see here the point here is the private sector. I think mobilizing the private capital in support of the SDGs and the climate change is important. But there exist the market barriers and the institutional and the regulatory barriers. IRIA has done a survey we interviewed about 400 private institutions and the banks. And then what we asked them, what prevents them to mobilizing the resources, mobilizing financial resources in support of that investments. We find basically 3 categories of the barriers. One is the policy barriers that comes with changing the policies and as well as the complex regulatory procedures. Nearly more than 70% of these investors and the banks, they say this is the main barrier. The second cluster of barriers comes in the institutional barriers, which looks into this recovery period, and particularly this climate change investment has long term to have a recovery period. And nearly 45% of these interviewed people say that it took nearly more than 5 years to get their capital returns. And also some of the projects, they need a high collateral requirement and the lack of capacity to value the assets. And then third cluster of the barriers is related to the markets. We do have the several risks associated with these investments. The technological advancement risk, and then unstable consumer markets, and the non-favorable interest rates. These are the market risks. So this risk has to be addressed in a collective and in a comprehensive way. Then we also went back to these institutional investors and the market players and the technological developers. So what type of international structure or international cooperation we could aim for to enhance the investments? And that includes, there are five.
Would you please summarize in 1 minute so because of the time?
Five type of pathways. One is the establishing the carbon price and developing a financial warranty program. And third one is establishing a transition guarantee fund. And the fourth one is developing a taxonomy of sustainable finance. So this is my last slide, and that shows there are efficient pathways. These pathways has to be looked into is optimizing the trade-offs and maximizing the complementarities. Second one is harnessing the full potentials of the international cooperation. And third one is proactively engaging the private sector. That needs a new governance framework at the global and the regional level that look into basically three aspects. One is developing an implementation toolkit with the good practices on this infrastructure governance. And second thing is forward-looking vision for the country reviews and the reports, and make this tailored recommendations for the more resilient and innovative infrastructure. Third one is a key tool to advance the dialogue on the infrastructure planning, investment, and delivery to generate the long-lasting impacts. So I stop here and look forward for the further discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for Mr. Ambumoji for your keynote speech and pointing out key issues including the city interlinkage and the barriers and opportunities for climate investment. It will be a good basis for discussion today. So I would like to move to the discussion with the panelists. We have 8 distinguished panelists for the discussion today. So I would like to organize the discussion as follows. For the first round, I will allocate 6 minutes for each speaker to respond to 1 or 2 prepared questions, and in addition to that, to make any messages from your own viewpoint. Then in the second round, I would like to ask each panelist to make additional comments in roughly 2 minutes, responding to other interventions to further deepen the discussion. So now I would like to start the discussion. First, I would like to invite Ms. Kumi Kitamori, Acting Deputy Director, Environment Directorate and Head of Green Growth and Global Relations Division, OECD, for your intervention. The question for you is the 2030 Agenda on SDGs and the UNFCCC Paris Agreement on Climate were both adopted in 2015. We are now already halfway to 2030. And where did we make good progress and where we are off track? So Ms. Kitamori, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this very, very important and timely conference. I hope our technology is with us. I hope you hear me fine in terms of microphone. So I said it's timely because we have, as we know, less than 8 years left to 2030. We all know that the governments need to ramp up our efforts to meet both the climate goals and other key SDGs. And also today we are meeting at a very critical time with the challenging global economic situations as we come out of the COVID pandemic. We might say we haven't come out yet. And also we have a war raging in the middle of Europe, in Ukraine, with energy and commodity price increases and emerging social instability. But this double economic shock should not be an excuse to lose sight of tackling climate change and biodiversity loss and other key SDGs. So today I'd like to share some views from the OECD on priority actions that governments can take to accelerate our efforts, focusing on public finance, public spending, to see how they are aligned with climate and other environmental goals. As we enter the COVID pandemic, governments collectively spent a lot of money around the world, a lot of public money to provide social protection to citizens and then to shore up the economy. At the same time, many countries pledged that this economic recovery had to be green and then to build back better and greener to emerge out of the COVID pandemic. At the OECD, we have been tracking such measures in our OECD's Green Recovery database. And this database tracks all recovery-related public spending that are relevant to the environment. It contains some 1,500 government measures with environmental relevance spread over 44 countries of the OECD and also European Union and selected emerging economies. The database covers measures that range from environmental dimensions such as climate, air pollution, but also those relevant to water, biodiversity, waste management, etc. Our latest update from this past April shows that about 1/3, or we could say 33% of all the recovery spending since the start of the pandemic, and that amounted to about just over $1 trillion, or to spell out, 1,090 billion US, depending on how you define the trillion, has been positive to the environment, meaning addressing the primary goal of providing citizens and companies some protection and kickstarting the economy, and at the same time addressing these climate and other environmental goals. So the majority of these green spending targeted climate change, about over 80%, and over 60% of those public spending addressed air pollution. However, the opportunities continue to be missed around within this public spending across other sectors such as agriculture, forestry, waste management, and waste recycling that are also important priorities. So when we say that about 33% of the public spending for recovery was green, that means that the balance, the remaining 67% of the recovery spending had either no impact on the environment, neutral, or actually some of those are harmful to the environment. So, one could look at it either as a glass half full or glass half empty, or in this case, a third full and 2/3 empty. But in my view, it was a great missed opportunity not to better align public spending to have more of it to go towards green measures. Now, another type of public spending that we track at the OECD is environmentally harmful subsidies. Now, the recent estimates suggest that potentially environmentally harmful government support amounts to some $680 billion annually. This is per year annually. And those include support going towards fossil fuel production and consumption, and also other types of support to agriculture and fishery, etc., some of which can be considered to be harmful to the environment. Now, this is annual spending. So this means that after only 2 years of such environmentally harmful subsidies, that amounts to almost canceling out all the green recovery spending that governments put together that are being spent over multiple years. So just to conclude on some of these numbers that we are tracking at the OECD on public finance, governments could be doing much more to better target their spending to align with the goals of tackling climate change and other environmental challenges. So I stop here for this round. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kitamori-san, for your very comprehensive presentation. It is very useful to have a broad perspective on the situation, and you also pointed out the important issue of environmentally harmful subsidies in the context of green recovery. Thank you very much. Now I would like to move to the next speaker. I'd like to invite Mr. Alisher Mamadzonov, sorry for my about pronunciation, Climate Policy and Government Specialist, Green Climate Fund, GCF. The question for you is, where do we stand on achieving the Paris climate financing goals? So, Mr. Mamadozanov, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Mr. Moderator, distinguished excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank the co-conveners of the conference for invitation to contribute to this session on behalf of the Green Climate Fund Secretariat. And thank you very much also for your question, which I will of course dwell on, but also of course adding information on how the Green Climate Fund is supporting developing countries in meeting their climate action ambitions. The Green Climate Fund is a critical element of the historic Paris Agreement and is the world's largest climate fund mandated to support low-emission, climate-resilient development pathways. As an operating entity of the financial mechanism of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, GCF contributes to the goal of keeping an average global temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius. As we heard yesterday during the high-level opening session, sustainable development goals cannot be achieved without urgent and bold action to combat climate change. SDG 13 on climate is intrinsically linked to all 16 of the other goals of the 2030 Agenda. The link between climate action and sustainable development is also recognized in key GCF documents and frameworks. The governing instrument of GCF stipulates that in the context of sustainable development, the fund will promote the paradigm shift towards low emission and climate resilient development pathways by providing support to developing countries to limit or reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to the impacts of climate change. This was also echoed in our investment framework and the integrated results management framework adopted by the board last year, whose core indicators quantitatively track major climate-focused outcomes of the GCF funded projects and are aligned with those of climate finance mechanisms, national statistical authorities, and the Sustainable Development Goals, which is of course important in the context of the conference. The link between climate action and sustainable development is therefore translated into everyday operations of the Green Climate Fund. Now coming to the main question, where we stand on the climate finance goals. As we all know, the annual goal for developed countries to provide and mobilize $100 billion of climate finance per year for climate action in developing countries was due to have been met in 2020 and to be sustained to 2025. The last OECD assessment of progress released prior to COP26 in Glasgow showed that climate finance provided and mobilized by developed countries totaled around 80 billion in 2019. So the developed countries haven't yet met the goal, and further OECD estimates that the goal is likely to be met by in 2023, so next year. But even if with the important decisions at COP26 in Glasgow on climate finance, including the initiations of deliberations on a new collective quantified goal on climate finance and the start of the relevant ad hoc work program, and also the important commitment to at least double climate finance for adaptation to developing countries, we all understand that trillions and not billions are required for climate action around the world. And actually, as was shown in the first needs determination report by the Standing Committee on Finance, the needs as were expressed in the nationally determined contributions by developing countries amount to about 6 trillion by 2030. And this is not, of course, the final figure because many of the needs were not costed in the NDCs provided by countries. Therefore, public finance should be used to catalyze large-scale finance flows, especially from the private sector. The Green Climate Fund works with developing countries on a daily basis. We understand the importance of continued strong support from developed countries. Through our programming, we see that support converted into transformational projects is provided to transformational projects in developing countries. I'm also very glad to report to you that just yesterday, the 33rd meeting of the GCF board was concluded, And we have now reached an important milestone of 200 projects approved by the board to support developing countries in their climate action. And now our total portfolio stands at 10.8 billion US dollars in GCF funding, and together with co-financing has exceeded $40 billion. Therefore, we will continue to support countries. Also, of course, it is important to mention that the board at its meeting yesterday has launched the next second replenishment of the fund for the period of 2024 to 2027. Scaling up and enhancing the effectiveness of climate finance requires multiple components. And therefore GCF takes a four-pronged approach to climate financing. I will go through them very quickly, understanding that the time is limited. The first prong promotes the enabling environment for climate action. This involves removing barriers to novel climate solutions and maximizing co-benefits between mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development by promoting integrated strategies, planning, and policy making. The second prong accelerates climate innovation through the investment in new innovative technologies, business models, financial instruments, and practices. That's linking also to the theme of the session about technology and access to technologies. The third prong mobilizes finances at scale. As I already mentioned, it is very important. GCF leverages scarce public resources to de-risk and crowding private finance for climate solutions at scale, particularly for adaptation, nature-based solutions, least developed countries, and small island developing states. Finally, the fourth prong aligns finance with sustainable development. GCF develops the capacity of domestic financial institutions to mainstream climate risk and opportunities in investment decision-making. Amidst the global climate emergency, we must continue to respond to the needs of developing countries. GCF remains committed to supporting developing countries in meeting their climate ambitions to serve the goals of the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC. Thank you very much, and looking forward to answering any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very informative presentation. It is very useful to understand the critical role of GCF to enhance the synergies between climate and SDGs. Thank you very much. Now I would like to invite Ms. Vice Naran, Senior Analyst, Climate Policy Initiative. The question for Ms. Naran is also, where do we stand on achieving the Paris climate financing goals? So now, Ms. Naran, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Takahashi-san. So CPI is an analysis and advisory organization where we help governments, businesses, and financial institutions drive economic growth while addressing climate change. I currently lead our climate finance tracking work stream. So today I'm here to share a slightly different perspective than our previous panelists, looking into global climate finance flows and just sharing some perspective on where we stand and how we move forward from the baseline. So our organization is known for monitoring global finance flows, climate finance flows, providing a very detailed picture of how finance is flowing from where to which solutions. And of course, climate finance is a core component of the Paris Agreement. So just to note that here we have a slightly different angle where we look into not only finance flows from developed to developing countries, also known as the 100 billion goal that Mr. Alisher referred to, but we look holistically at both public and private finances. So our most recent analysis showed that global finance flows, climate finance flows, reached about 630 billion annually, and it's been increasing over the past 10 years. But what is more important to note is that the climate finance has been increasing, and then although it's been gaining political momentum here, climate finance really actually needs to increase by at least 600 times, which is an enormous amount. And just to draw parallels to the previous intervention by Ms. Kitamori, 680 billion was going into harmful subsidies, but our climate finance flows also actually is lower than those harmful subsidies. The other thing about the needs, climate finance needs, is that it's really dependent on the course of action taken by the public and private finance providers and how smartly and efficiently use the financing sources. So the needs range can differ. It can be either 6 trillion that Mr. Alisher referred to, but it also depends really on the course of different action, as I mentioned, taken by different actors. But the general consensus is clear. We need trillions. We really need to ramp up action and be very, very ambitious in the next 10 years. And the important thing is, with every year of inaction, this will further exacerbate the costs, and global temperatures will continue to rise with it. And together with it, we'll see significant economic disruption and also human suffering. So no region is really aligned with the Paris Agreement goals, but we need to also be aware that developing countries and also emerging economies are particularly lagging in terms of climate finance. So the other point is the long-term finance goal of Paris Agreement calls for all finance flows to be consistent with low carbon and climate resilient pathways. But the current scope and scale of global climate finance is really grossly insufficient to limit the worst effect of climate change. So as you can see on the slide is that climate finance actually still represents a very small fraction compared to what's going on in polluting sectors. So we still, today use an energy that we consume. It's still fossil fuel based majority. And electric vehicles, for example, it's really becoming popular, but if you look into the numbers, it's a very small fraction of what's being purchased globally. And the same with our buildings. The other point is, critically, the investment in adaptation constitutes also a very small fraction of what is needed to avoid costly and catastrophic future. So our most recent numbers track that about $46 billion were spent annually, and it only accounts for about 7% of total climate finance flows. And then just 2 days ago in London, we experienced the hottest recorded temperature ever. And we experienced in the first hand that we're not adapted to these extreme weather events. And again, adaptation finance really needs to scale up, and the benefits of adaptation finance actually is over the costs. And really the question here, and as panelists pointed to, we really need to think about how to mobilize more private money, and even if we spend all public money, reaching the level required to the trillions is not just going to be enough. Yeah, so I'll stop here for now, and looking forward to further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very valuable interventions and your presentations. Very, very clear that identified a huge gap now in the climate finance and possible measures to reduce the gap in the future. Thank you very much. Now next, I would like to welcome Ms. Jane Burston, Executive Director, Clean Air Fund. The question for you is as follows. We are falling short of Paris climate finance goals. We know that action on air quality fulfills several funding aims on climate, health, and equity. How can climate funding be smarter and incorporate these aims too? And how can we further scale up proven climate change solutions? So, Ms. Burston, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So yes, of course, we all know that air pollution and climate change are inextricably linked. And so by tackling climate change in a way that reduces air pollution, we can deliver on lots of other SDG areas, on health, helping to address inequality, and building stronger economies. So I can talk through each of those areas and the implications for climate finance. So the reason that air pollution and climate change are so closely linked is that most outdoor air pollution is caused by burning fossil fuels. And obviously, if the causes are the same, the solutions can be the same as well. Many of the things that other panelists have been talking about, renewable energy, electric mobility, and also things like more walking and cycling, so which obviously need financing for the infrastructure around those. There's also the link between air quality and climate change because some pollutants are also climate forcing. So pollutants like black carbon have very high global warming potentials. And so there's a really important effect in mitigating those for short-term climate change. We're finding at the Clean Air Fund that there isn't a huge amount of joined up action on air pollution and climate. And so we're failing to get these additional benefits for other SDGs from a lot of climate finance. Most of the climate change decision-making processes don't account for the savings for the health system and for businesses when you reduce air pollution. And that means that quite a few powerful climate actions aren't initiated because they're considered too costly and not all of the benefits are included. There was a piece of work done by Dalberg consultants trying to look at how much climate action would flip to net beneficial if you also counted the economic benefits, the health benefits of reducing air pollution at the same time as greenhouse gases. And those additional measures accounted for an additional 8 gigatons of annual carbon removal, which, you know, if there's that much additional carbon removal that could flip to net positive economically, then that's a huge amount on that cost curve. So how does climate action, especially when it incorporates action on air pollution, affect health? Well, we know that air pollution is the single largest environmental health risk globally. It's responsible for 15% of early deaths every single year, 7 million deaths. Outdoor air pollution causes more than 4 million deaths every year. And it's, as well as the deaths, which is the kind of absolutely shocking statistic, there's many millions more people who are suffering poor quality of life because of the illnesses that they have because of air pollution. And the health impacts evidence is increasing all of the time. We've seen recently that pollution also causes things like decreases in fertility, increase in miscarriages, and there's been recent links shown to dementia and Parkinson's disease. And unfortunately, like lots of other health risks, the impact of air pollution is actually getting worse. So these premature deaths from air pollution are forecast to double by 2050. Shockingly, air pollution also has a disproportionate impact on children's health. And, and that's because children are more exposed and, because they play outside more, they're breathing closer to the ground where a lot of the pollution is more intense. And they're more vulnerable physiologically because their organs are still developing. And so that kind of brings in quite significant consequences for education. If schools are closed because air pollution is high, kids aren't getting their education. Equally, if pollution is high, or even at very moderate levels, the kids can't concentrate, and so they're not getting the quality of education that they need. Obviously, pollution levels, as with climate change, affects those who are the most vulnerable the most. So in all parts of the world, people living in poverty are more likely to live in areas where they're exposed to high levels of air pollution, like next door to a busy road or an industrial site. And the vast majority of those early deaths that I mentioned that the World Health Organization calculates are from outdoor air pollution in low and middle income countries. So people living in poverty are more likely to be exposed to poor air quality, more likely to have the pre-existing conditions, health conditions, or less access to healthcare that makes the effects of that exposure worse for them. And obviously much less able to make the choices like buying air purifiers than people in richer neighborhoods can. So I think there's all of these contributions to different SDGs that work on climate and air pollution in conjunction with one another can affect. The good news from a climate finance point of view is that work to reduce air pollution does have these huge economic benefits, and they start immediately. So pollution can drop overnight, and the short-term health effects of air pollution then immediately stop. We know that from OECD work that there's trillions available for in benefits if we start to tackle air pollution. And some of the work that the Clean Air Fund has funded also looks into what the benefit for businesses is, because obviously if we're not being poisoned by toxic pollution, we can concentrate better, we can attend work more often because we're not staying home sick, or we're not staying home to look after sick children. And the business benefits are pretty big. So we did a piece of work with the Confederation of British Industry in the UK, which calculated that if the UK just simply reduced air pollution from the current level to the previous World Health Organization guideline limit, that the economic benefits every year to businesses would be 1.6 billion sterling. In India, the numbers were quite a lot bigger. Dalberg did a piece of work showing that 3% of GDP would be saved if air pollution dropped to clean levels. So, and that doesn't include any of the short-term cognitive effects, because that's quite hard to calculate. That's simply benefits to businesses from increased productivity because people are able to show up at work more because they're less sick. But what we're finishing on...
Sorry, would you please summarize? Sorry for the time.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Last point. Just finishing on this point about, has it increased climate finance? The answer, unfortunately, is not yet. Every year we publish a report called The State of Global Air Quality Finance, and the next one's due out on Clean Air Day, 7th of September. And unfortunately, the last one last year showed development funders are still actually spending more money on prolonging the life of fossil fuels than investing in these clean air and climate synergies. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very convincing remarks, and in particular the importance of recognizing the economic and health benefits of the climate action, in particular close interlinkage with the air pollution. It's most biggest risk factor for health. Now, thank you very much. Now I would like to move to invite Mr. Takao Aiba, Chairman of the Subcommittee on Planning, Keidanren Committee on Nature Conservation, and he's also the Project General Manager, Environmental Affairs and Engineering Management Division, Carbon Neutral Advanced Engineering Development Center, Toyota Motor Companies, Toyota Motor Corporation. So, the question for Mr. Aiba is where do we make good progress? Where are we off track, and how can we leverage further engagement of private sectors, and how can we accelerate innovation to respond to the current crisis? So now, Mr. Aiba, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Takahashi-san. My name is Takao Aiba, and on behalf of Keidanren, I'd like to explain our view toward nature conservation today, and I'm also working for Toyota. And firstly, I'd like to explain who we are and what is the Keidanren Committee on Nature Conservation. And the Keidanren is a comprehensive economic organization with a membership comprised of 1,500 companies of Japan and more than 100 nationwide industry associations and so on. And the KCNC is a Keidanren sister organization, which is founded in 1992 and after the Rio Earth Summit. And we have about 120 members from various sectors. Our activity is mainly the three categories of actions. First one is support for NGOs through Nature Conservation Fund. since the establishment, we are providing the financial support for more than 1,700 projects in totaling more than 40 million US dollars. And the second one is awareness raising, and through our biodiversity conservation initiative, and we are providing many information to member companies and hosting many events, and increase awareness for the importance of biodiversity conservation. And also the policy recommendation or policy engagement activities with government, and we have a daily communication with the Ministry of the Environment, Government of Japan, and try to convey our business view to the government and to facilitate our action on conservations. And we also launched the Keidanren Biodiversity Conservation Initiative in 2020. Under the initiative, we are requesting Japanese business community to adopt this declaration, and already more than 260 companies have agreed and shared. So best example of business case for the nature conservation, and more than 137. And so this is the image of website, and if you can click the logo of company, you can check their action and their policy and so on. And also we started the project called Business for GBF, Global Biodiversity Framework, which shares many examples of Japanese companies' action on mainstreaming biodiversity through video and website. There are technology examples and the product and the service examples, and which could contribute for global biodiversity target and goals. And also we are hosting many events or dialogues. We had the dialogue with Ms. Elizabeth Maluma Lema, Executive Secretary of CBD, and Professor Dasgupta about economics of biodiversity and so on. And this year we also had a dialogue with Mr. Tony Goldner, Executive Director of TNFD, and so through such kind of activity, we provide information for member companies. And my question to answer would be what kind of progress we made, and since maybe the Aichi target, and actually regarding Aichi target, which was adopted COP10 and under the presidency of Japan, maybe we have to recognize that most of the targets were not fully achieved. But I think it should be considered meaningful one, as it has been significantly increasing awareness for biodiversity conservation across the world, including business world. Actually, our annual survey on our member shows that the number of companies which take biodiversity issue into their corporate philosophy or vision have doubled from 10 years ago to 2009 and to 2019. And now about 80% of companies take the biodiversity issue into their business philosophy and so on. And the second question is how can we leverage further engagement of private sectors? And I think comparing to climate change, biodiversity is more complex and need to be carefully treated in each local context. So many companies, especially for small, medium-sized companies, do not have a clear idea about what kind of action we should take to conserve nature or to be a nature positive. And we expect post-2020 global biodiversity framework will be which will be adopted this year, and through that process we'd like to see some supportive measures for private sector to take more and more actions for biodiversity conservations. And Actually, I think the one of key issue is best practice sharing. And as we don't know what we should do, so the best practice is a good source of information. And so that through our K-Learning activity, we are providing such example. And also we are working with Ministry of the Environment, and we share the effective technology and product and so on. And secondly, maybe I think we should build supportive environment or infrastructure for companies to take actions for biodiversity conservation. In the Global Biodiversity Framework first draft, I see many metrics and targets, but many of them seem to be not clearly defined and may not align with actual situation we face. We should at first clearly understand the impact of business activity on biodiversity and establish reliable traceability system for our global supply chain and value chain. As we don't know the real situation, it's not feasible to take effective actions. To improve the situation, we need attentive cooperation from countries that host export of forest-related commodities such as palm, soy, coffee, timber, and so on, and governmental support to establish traceability system and the related database, which are critical infrastructure for us to take effective actions. Then, we should clarify what we should do and what kind of action is expected. Then we can take effective actions. And the third one, last question, is how can we accelerate innovation to respond to the current crisis? And actually, I think for innovation, basically both clarifying the needs for innovation and or inducing technological push through basic R&D support are necessary. So then, in addition, maybe I think to foster the healthy, positive competition among the companies, we should be very transparent situation and with reliable traceability system. And at the same time, I think important point is that our actions should be well recognized and evaluated positively, even though that kind of business action may not be able to gain economic return. And actually, now we are discussing about 30 by 30 target, and we are discussing how business can contribute to such target. And one of major is other effective area-based conservation measures. But so far, not so clear. So how companies' action to protect some area will be recognized or can gain some financial compensation and so on. So then we need such clarification, and maybe without even financial compensation, maybe there's some appropriate acknowledgement would be stimulate our actions to promote our further action, and it will induce some further innovation and so on. And finally, I'd like to emphasize, Japanese business community is very positive for the nature positive, economy and the conservation of nature. And we'd like to see the synergy, both nature and climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aiba-san, for your presentation, expressing the Japanese industry initiative, collaborating with various national, local, global initiatives. And also you kindly focus on the specific issues in the biodiversity conservation, some difficulties and complexity of biodiversity, and the importance of the sharing best practices, and also the importance of traceability issue. Thank you very much. Now, I would like to invite next speaker, Miss Vanessa Gray. I would like to welcome Miss Nawar Al-Hossani, permanent representative of the United Arab Emirates to the International Renewable Energy Agency. The question for you is how can we further scale up proven climate change solutions and how can we accelerate innovation to respond to the current crisis? So, Ms. Al-Hosani, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chair, and good evening, good morning, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are joining us. It is an actual honor and pleasure to be with you, and thank you for hosting me. Before I address your question, I just would like to share a message on the topic. I believe that there should be no barriers to when it comes to protecting the future of our species, yet we still see that there are so many barriers. So I would maybe suggest that we reframe the challenge. So when we discuss financing technology and innovation for a climate resilient future, what we mean is investing in the future of human species, because when it comes down to it, if climate change continues at the rate it is going, it is us, the humans, that won't survive, not the planet. Earth will recover and repair long after we're gone. So when I say there should be no barrier, this is exactly why. The existence of our species is on the line. So how do we do this? I guess quite simply, we must make green finance the norm. And we shouldn't even need to use the word green in front of finance, not today nor tomorrow. Investing in sustainable climate resilient technologies, diversifying economies, and developing state-of-the-art innovative energy projects should be part and parcel of the global financial systems. We have the will and the means to take us to the desired future state. The money and the ambition clearly exist. So the challenge is identifying where and how to invest it. And as a first mover and a long-standing regional champion of the global energy transition, the UAE has shown how we can strike the balance between remaining responsible energy provider while proactively seeking to diversify our energy mix as we lay the foundation for a future that is powered by cleaner renewable energy solutions. So when it comes to putting this philosophy into action, a prime example is the Net Zero by 2050 strategic initiative, which the UAE government launched ahead of the COP26 last year. The UAE, under this Net Zero strategic initiative, will invest further $160 billion into new renewable energy projects while scaling up existing infrastructure. To put those numbers into context, to date, we have invested more than $40 billion in domestic clean energy projects. This will build on 2 decades of climate innovation to drive further sustainable development at home and abroad. And to achieve our mid-century strategy, we are scaling up our investments in advanced technologies to help clear our heavy industries, investing in clean and renewable energy research and development, developing a pipeline of talent to lead the way to future powered by renewable energy, and working closely with our international partners to oversee a just and inclusive global energy transition. So in short, we have been very active on the fronts of policy making, advanced technology development, and empowering our human capital to ensure we are in the best position possible to achieve a net zero economy. And internationally, we are supporting other countries to achieve the same level of momentum and trust for investors. We are doing this by providing financial tools such as the Energy Transition Accelerator Finance (ETAF) platform, which we developed with IRENA, International Renewable Energy Agency, to increase global renewable energy capacity to 1.5 gigawatt by 2030. We strongly support the work of IRENA, especially in their guidance to countries improving their energy policies to get them ready for the energy transition while creating opportunities for investors. So to your questions, how we can further scale up proven climate change solutions, the world as we know is transforming. Our window of opportunity to act is narrowing, as we heard from previous speakers. As we have seen in the news this week, Europe is actually hotter than the Middle East in the summer months. And we are heading towards a resource-constrained future. We have to act quickly if we are to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees and prevent the worst. So overcoming these challenges required a complete reconfiguration of existing system and infrastructure. And to understand where to go next in clean energy innovation, we should look back at some of the extraordinary progress that has already been made. So since 2010, the price of solar electricity have fallen by 89%. The efficiency of solar panels increased by more than 25%. Onshore wind energy costs have dropped 70% in the past decade. Renewables have become the cheapest source of new electricity production around the world. And these developments were spurred by large government investment and conducive energy policies. Right now, we need a blend of public and private financing as an engine for emerging climate technologies, whether it be renewable energy, clean fuels of the future like hydrogen or carbon capture, storage and utilization solutions. The momentum, I believe, is here. The global green financing, although not enough, but has already risen over 100-fold in the past decade. We also need to create ecosystems to enable innovation, to flourish and thrive. We already have the tools to keep climate change and global warming in check, but we need to continue to invest in newer, better solutions to accelerate the pace of deployment of clean energy while striking the right balance of energy security, which is one of the key priorities on the global agenda at this moment. How we can accelerate innovation to respond to the current crisis. Some of you maybe, and we in the UAE have seen in the address of His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, which was the first address to the nation as a president of the UAE, people are the UAE's and the world's most valuable resource. Empowering people to become change makers and innovators will be key to unlocking innovation across the board, putting people first and enabling them to stand firm and bring stability to the rest of the value chain, whether it is by supply chain, economic systems, or our energy systems. A fundamental part of putting people first is investing in our youth as the torchbearers of the new technology-based digital economy that we now live and work in. Our young people will be the ones who design and implement innovative approaches by tackling the climate change. There must be a renewed emphasis on education to teach young people about the future of our planet from an earlier age. In this regard, the International Renewable Energy Agency, with the support of the UAE, has recently launched an initiative called Educate the Educators. The initiative will see renewable energy and climate experts teaching our teachers about current climate crisis to equip them with the knowledge that can pass on and teach their students in the topic of the global energy transition from an early age. So reaching out and involving students in the formative years by providing them with wider knowledge of the world outside the traditional curriculums will be crucial to fostering and incubating an innovative mindset from early age. So beyond the classrooms, we also need the right policies in place to create an enabling ecosystem to incubate new ideas and encourage research and development. We believe that the UAE has set an example by investing in intellectual property protection, improving the ease of doing business in the Middle East, and ensuring a world-class infrastructure. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much for your very informative intervention and very thought-provoking intervention with a very strong commitment for the future sustainability, in particular the energy transitions, including various factors, including some issue of education for younger people. Thank you very much. Now I would like to invite Ms. Vanessa Gray, Head of Environment and Emergency Telecommunication Division, Telecommunication Development Bureau, International Telecommunication Union, ITU. So the question for Ms. Gray is which important new technologies may help to better mitigate climate emission in the future, and how can we overcome the digital divide in less and least developed countries? So Ms. Gray, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, so just briefly a bit of context, because the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, is the UN Specialized Agency for Information and Communication Technologies, and our main mandate is to connect the world and to bring the opportunities of digitalization to everyone. So here ITU studies the potential of digitalization and new technologies to reduce emissions, but of course we also recognize and we need to improve our understanding of how digitization results in rising electricity use and of course also greater emissions. And here just one example, just 2 weeks ago we published a new report called Greening Digital Companies, where we look at the 150 largest information and communication technology or tech companies to understand mainly two things. First, how digital tools and new technologies enable organizations and individuals to avoid emissions. So I think this goes directly back to your question. But then in this report, we also see how digital companies or how the tech sector can trigger carbon reductions throughout their own footprint. And this, I think, is something, the lessons learned from this report are important not just for the ICT industry, but also for any other sector. Next slide, please. So if we look at the emissions data, here we have the graphic. We look at the scope 1 and 2. So that's the operational emissions from the use of fuels and electricity. But we also, of course, you look at scope 3, so the company's upstream and downstream activities to understand companies' entire emission footprint. And here we see that digital companies today are playing a notable role in the race to a carbon-free planet because they purchase a lot of renewable energy and they make investments in carbon removal, for example, just some of the examples from our report. Next slide, please. One important point is that we found gaps in the availability and the depth of the climate data. And we really here see an opportunity to ensure that all companies report data based on standards, which allow for the comparison of results. And in addition, it is recommended that climate data be assured by a third party and that companies produce a standalone environmental report. We have also highlighted in our report some good practices, such as the one from Swisscom on the reporting. You see here the cover page of their report, which follows international standards on reporting on greenhouse gas emissions. In terms of setting targets for becoming green, we also saw great differences in terms of the ambition, in terms of the scope and the measurement among the 150 companies that we looked at. Some companies aim to eliminate their entire footprint by 2030, while others are less ambitious with longer term targets like 2050 or even later. So, you know, some I would say questionable targets that are too far away. Next slide, please. Also, just to look at the renewables, we saw that many digital companies, like those in other sectors, are reducing energy use in their facilities through use of sensors to control temperatures, by constructing green buildings and converting to electric vehicles, just to give a few examples. We also saw that digital companies are leaders in green energy procurement, as well as innovative initiatives for tools and mechanisms to drive and to scale renewable energy markets. And if we look here at the left-hand side, the left-hand graph, you see that 6 digital companies are among the top 10 world's largest corporate purchasers of renewable energy. On the right-hand side, we see that the ICT sector accounted for about half of the global corporate renewable energy procurement in 2020. So very promising results here from the tech sector. Next slide, please. Now, to directly address your question, we also look at how digital technologies, new technologies and innovation, products and services, how these are driving emissions reductions across other sectors. So not just, we're not just looking at within the ICT sector, but the impact that the ICT sector has on other sectors. And here are a few examples. We see that Internet of Things, IoT sensors that are placed in heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems are enabling energy and reductions. We also see that blockchain is facilitating renewable trade on distributed energy networks. We see AI-based techniques that are producing more precise forecasting, for example, of wind and solar production, and through this then are optimizing the use of renewables on the grid. But we also see robots that are disassembling used digital devices. Here we're talking about electronic waste, e-waste, an area where ITUS also has many initiatives. And robots are used to extract raw materials, which then can be reused, and which also reduces the impact on climate change. We also today see that the use of digital services contribute to avoided emissions, and therefore is sometimes referred to as scope 4. And companies have started to measure this, and ITU is actually currently working on a standardized methodology for this enablement measurement. Next slide, please. Finally, you mentioned the digital divide, and this is of course a key concern for the ITU, because again, our key mission remains to connect the world and address and overcome the digital divide to ensure that everyone today in the world benefits from the opportunities of ICTs. But to do so, ITU collects and publishes key country, regional, and global ICT data and statistics, so for example, on the number of internet users. But here, just to draw your attention to a recently published report, the Global Connectivity Report 2022 that came out just about a month ago, and which discusses ways not just of addressing the digital divide, but really moving towards meaningful connectivity, which we define as the possibility of a safe, satisfying, enriching, productive, and affordable online experience for everyone, and which we see as the new imperative for the 2020 to 2030 decade of action to deliver on the SDGs. And here we've identified a number of key challenges, and this is, first of all, we need to close the coverage gap, because even though 95% of the world population is now within range of a mobile broadband network, so in theory, these 95% of the population can connect to the internet, we know that at least 390 million people have no possibility to connect the internet, so there's a coverage gap that we need to address. But then, and probably even more important, we need to close the usage gap. And we know that 1 in 3 individuals who could go online, so who has access to the internet, chooses not to. And that's mainly because the costs are too high, or there's lack of access to a device, or the device is too expensive, and also there's lack of awareness and skills and purpose. So people think that they don't see a benefit in using the internet, and that's of course also often goes back to the lack of people's languages being represented on the internet. So these are some of the key barriers that we see in bringing meaningful connectivity to everyone and addressing the digital divide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very valuable comments, and it is very useful to understand the potential contribution of the digital technology to reduce emissions, and also necessary measures to address the gaps to attain the meaningful connectivity for all, which is very critical for the SDGs. Thank you very much. Now, I would like to move to the final panelist, my colleague, Mr. Eric Zossman, a team leader in Integrated Sustainable Center of IGES. And the question for you is, what are the key messages in terms of financing the technology and innovation from the conference background note, for which IGES and your team played a very important role to compile? And what are the expected solutions to overcome barriers to financing technologies and innovation? So Eric, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Takahashi-san and colleagues. And this is a very important question, of course. So I want to begin by highlighting that some of the key messages on finance relate to the very nature of recognizing synergies and trying to limit trade-offs themselves. And this begin with the fact that when we start to think about the linkages between climate change and sustainable development, basically if we start to explicitly recognize all of these different benefits, this can make a stronger argument for taking climate action. The benefits, whether they be air quality benefits or protecting biodiversity, can offset the costs of climate action. So the argument goes one way, and then the argument also goes the other way as well, and this was highlighted in the GCF remarks. That is, if we begin to explicitly recognize all of these benefits, then we can make sure that carbon finance or climate finance can meet core development needs. And that can range, of course, from improving public health to empowering women, to also protecting children. So both of these directions are highlighted in this background note. I think it's important to put that into sharp focus when we think about some of our key messages. And then the other things that I would like to highlight in terms of moving forward with some of these ideas are also featured in the background note, is if we're going to bring carbon finance to development needs, I think we need to do a better job of recognizing and rewarding co-benefits within climate finance. So the GCF has made some efforts in this regard. There are colleagues that work on what's called the gold standard that have done this on a voluntary basis. The Asian Development Bank is currently working on a program to do this. And we're also working with stakeholders at Kyushu University to help better recognize and reward co-benefits from climate finance. Similarly, and this is also highlighted in the background note, is we can also more explicitly recognize co-benefits in key climate actions. And this, of course, includes things like the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. We've done some research that shows that countries that reference the SDGs in their NDCs actually have higher levels of ambition in those NDCs. I think this comes back to this sort of realization that the climate change is delivering on multiple different dimensions of development. So recognizing in NDCs, and similarly going back from the SDGs to climate change and other development needs in our VNR processes, the voluntary national reviews, more explicitly making linkages to climate change and other development needs, whether that be, once again, air pollution, health, biodiversity, what have you. And then more strongly integrating our different actions, our NDCs, our VNRs, our MBSAPs for biodiversity. I think this is something else that's highlighted in our note. Now, the other things that I would like to underline that I think are really important moving forward is if we're going to work on these synergies and push them to the front of our policy discussions, I think we really need to think about changing three different I's. And when I say I mean the letter I. And that is, first of all, we need to change sort of ideas, our norms, and the way that we think about how development moves forward. And so normative innovation and changing the way that we conceive of development is critically important. And this was highlighted, I think, by many different presenters, but changing norms and ideas is important. The second I is institutions. So that's changing the way that decisions are made at different levels of government and also across our value chains and across our supply chains. So changing the way that decisions are made so that we're focusing on multiple objectives at the same time. And I think we see this happening in some countries already. So for instance, we see this happening to some extent in Indonesia, where there's tagging of budgets for multiple development objectives. When they look at climate finance, we see this happening in China to some extent when they're working on air pollution and climate change goals under their coal control strategies. And I think we also see this at the subnational level in places like, for instance, California, where the California Global Warming Solutions Act also looked more explicitly at health and air pollution benefits. So changing institutions and policies is another part of the story. So that's our second I. And then the third I is our interests. And what I mean by interests is sometimes we have vested interests that have perhaps a narrower view of what development should all be about. And so we need to work collectively to try to either change vested interests or look for ways that we can compensate some of the interests that might be opposed to moving forward with synergies. And this gets to, I think, as was highlighted by our colleague from the UAE, is, changing this enabling environment or this ecosystem. And really there, I think it's about trying to build coalitions of change between different stakeholders and different actor groups so that we can drive change in places like, for instance, in the United States, in West Virginia, for instance, in China, in the Rust Belt in China. We need to build coalitions of change that show those places that are against moving forward with some of these multi-objective approaches to demonstrate to them all of the different benefits that are potentially there, and then also have institutional frameworks, both not just policy, but political institutional frameworks that can take those interests, these newly changed interests, and connect them to some different benefits. So this gets to another argument in the background note where we talk a lot about, it's not just about recognizing the different benefits, but also identifying to who those benefits accrue. And by doing that, I think we can build transformative partnerships that drive change at multiple levels and help us achieve, more action on climate change as well as the SDGs. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much, Takahashi-san.
Thank you, Eric, for your very comprehensive presentation. And I finished the first round, but because of the very tight schedule in this afternoon, I am sorry that I have to omit the second round. So I'm very sorry for that. But nevertheless, I have already asked Eric to make some short summary of the discussion today in your second round. So I think I would like to ask Eric to try to briefly summarize the main point of the discussion today. Eric, please.
Okay, yeah, so I'm sorry to talk so much, but basically we had a very rich and illuminating discussion on the opportunities for finance and innovation and technology to drive transformative change and to move forward this climate change and SDGs agenda. We moved all the way from, an introductory overview presentation from our colleague Anbu, where he highlighted the interlinked nature of SDG 13, underlined that there are a lot of barriers to taking advantage of these interlinkages ranging from market barriers to policy barriers. But at the same time, he also highlighted a few ways forward ranging from investing in young millennials because they'll invest in a better future, as well as a taxonomy of sustainable finance. Then we talked a little bit about opportunities for public finance, and our colleague from the OECD highlighted some of the work that they've been doing on a database to track public finance after COVID, noting that in some cases there's been some positive news in terms of the allocation of that finance for climate change, but there are also some missed opportunities. And there's also some lament that the subsidies, environmentally harmful subsidies, continue. From there, we moved into a discussion of one of the key international mechanisms to allocate climate finance, the GCF, which has made significant strides over the past 10 years or so, and is now allocating about $80 billion in climate finance, is helping to allocate about $80 billion in climate finance, and recently had a board of directors meeting where $10.8 billion is allocated. That's up to $40 billion with co-finance. And they're using a four-pronged approach. One of those prongs is focusing on enabling private finance and also recognizing the co-benefits of the private finance. But from there, we also recognize that if climate finance is going to move forward, we still have very big financing gaps. So our colleague from the Climate Policy Initiative underlined that we've seen significant increases in climate finance up to $630 billion, but still we need to ramp it up about 600 times. And that's still relatively small. The climate finance that's allocated is relatively small to finance that's allocated for conventional development reasons, Moreover, the adaptation gap is pretty significant, so we need to focus more on adaptation and resilience with other benefits for other sectors, of course. And from there, we discussed a little bit more about some of those other sectors, and we've talked a lot about, our colleague from the Clean Air Fund talked a lot about the linkages between air pollution and climate change, noting that in recent studies, if we would move forward, for instance, in India, with ambitious climate change policies, this would have a significant impacts on productivity among businesses, amounting to about 3% of GDP. At the same time, there's a little bit of bad news that's baked in here as well, because when we look at the state of climate finance for air quality, it's still sort of insufficient at this point. From there, we moved not only to the linkages between air pollution and climate change, but our colleague from the Keidan-ren talked a lot about the linkages between climate change and biodiversity, and how this new initiative from the Keidan-ren is really trying to leverage some of those synergies with a new declaration, and many companies within the Keidan-ren that are moving forward by mainstreaming these linkages into its decision-making processes. At the same time, we need to recognize that perhaps more so than the air pollution story, the linkages are perhaps more complex and context dependent for biodiversity, and that's going to require, perhaps a different set of tools and more knowledge on best practice sharing. And this is going to be especially important as we try to look at making these linkages within our supply chains and value chains. And then we started to think a little bit more about the potential for transformation and transitions, noting, for instance, that the climate threat is in many ways an existential threat for humanity itself, and therefore the transformation and transitions to a net zero economy are actually critical for the survival of the human race. And in the UAE context, we've seen some positive news there with the blending of public and private finance and the creation of ecosystems that have helped to enable innovation. And further, we've also seen some suggestions that to strengthen these enabling environments, it's going to be increasingly important to invest in our youth and make sure that our classrooms are animated by some of these ideas. And then last but not least, before we got to my presentation, we heard a little bit about the opportunities and challenges related to digitalization in terms of both reducing greenhouse gases and also delivering on the SDGs. We heard that, for instance, digital companies are reducing, are not only, promoting this agenda, promoting these agendas, but they're also reducing emissions outside of their, immediate scope by the use and sales of innovative technologies like IoT, blockchain, and AI. At the same time, in order to make sure that we do this in a way that leaves no one behind, we need to think a lot more about meaningful connectivity and making sure that I think it's about 1/3 of population at this point is still not connected. And so in closing, I would just like to highlight that I think we see, both a good side and a challenging side to the story of how do we take advantage of these synergies and limit our trade-offs by harnessing finance and innovation. I think that the panel really demonstrated both sides of those stories. And I think that's a lot of promise moving forward. And I think the one thing that I would like to sort of conclude with in terms of promise is an approach that's really worked well in Japan and is gaining some traction outside of Japan as well. This is known as the circulating ecological sphere. And it's an approach which really tries to blend together work on climate change with protecting biodiversity, as well as circulating circularity at the local level to optimize resource flows. And so you see many local areas now in Japan embracing this approach and working between rural and urban areas, especially so that, for instance, cities like Yokohama can get renewable energy from areas like Aomori, which have, greater land and can generate that energy. the CES approach, I think, typifies much of what's going on in terms of the synergies and trade-offs. It has a strong potential to be promoted through this conference and through other venues.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric. The time is finished, so thank you very much for your excellent summary. And before closing this session, I would like to ask Ms. Yurika Mori, Japan Youth Platform for Sustainability, to make comments from the view of youth. So I'm very sorry for keeping you waiting so long, but please make some fresh comments from you. Thank you. The floor is yours.
First of all, thank you so much for this opportunity. As many of the speakers emphasized, I also found synergistic cooperation, including further global partnership and split of global solidarity as essential. It is because all the finance, green, and technological measures suggested now cannot be achieved without the cooperation. I therefore expect this conference and this active and cooperative motion created throughout this conference to play a role as a bridge between multi-stakeholders to promote further inclusive partnership, not only for the present time, but also future time in the meaningful and inclusive way. In my view, meaningful means to guarantee the way how the collective voice is heard and reflected to the actual policy plans in the fair and equal way. Inclusive means to guarantee equal accessibility for all people, including vulnerable people. For example, we use are financially and socially vulnerable. However, youth voice is essential to make the society truly sustainable and pass down to sustainable society to even next generation. Therefore, appropriate supports such as subsidy and creating a long-term share in the decision-making process are important. This is not only for youth, but also all other vulnerable people, including indigenous people, people in developing countries, and all other vulnerable people. In addition to my comment, we youth are going to propose our proposal in the closing session later. We are grateful if you could look through it. Again, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mori-san, for your very strong and encouraging comments, and we are very looking forward to receive the voice from the youth in the closing session. So now I would like to conclude the session, and today we have very extremely fruitful discussions based on the broad and profound knowledges and experiences of the distinguished speakers, examining key issues relating barriers and opportunities and bringing various innovative ideas and suggestions toward accelerated implementation for advancing climate and SDG synergies. I really hope today's discussion will contribute to promoting our future collaborative efforts to transforming our society into a sustainable and resilient society. I would like to thank all the speakers for your excellent contributions. Thank you very much, and the session is now closed. Thank you very much.
Thank you.